In this video, I want to talk about what I think are the 5 most interesting army-wide rules in the 10th edition of Warhammer 40,000. So these can either be army rules or the detachment rules. And these aren't the most powerful ones. It's the ones I think are the most fun and creative. So I might have literally the least powerful ability on here. It's just the one I thought was a cool design as far as the lore matching the gameplay and how it plays on the tabletop. These are in no particular order, so let's start with the Taos Army rule, for the greater good. How this works is if you have 2 units with this ability, you can pair them up for a shooting attack. The supporting unit will act like a spotter, and a guided unit will be firing at the enemy. And the enemy you are shooting at has to be visible to both. If you're using this ability and shooting at the spotted unit, you get +1 to your ballistic skill, and if you're spotting with a marker light, you get to ignore cover. Cover is pretty powerful in 10th edition, so denying that and having better accuracy can be huge if you're spotting for one of your bigger and more powerful units. You do have to consider which unit is going to be better off having the buff, and that is a trade-off, but there is a stratagem you can use to overcome this. If you only have 2 of your bigger guns visible to one target, this is called Coordinate to Engage, and it lets you gain the guided benefit on a unit that is observing for another unit. So just because it's doing the spotting doesn't mean it won't be as powerful. The only negative to this is you actually have to worsen your ballistic skill by 1 if you're aiming at something that isn't your spotted target. My guess is that's supposed to represent the how targeting systems are lining up, and to shoot at something different you actually have to override these systems, so you get a negative for doing that. So the next army I'm going to talk about is the Thousand Sons. The Thousand Sons are famous for being a chapter of Psychers, and their army rule really leans into this, in its Cabal of Sorcerers. So this gives them the most Psyker flexibility of any army, and they do this through a point system. A lot of their units will have the Cabal of Sorcerers ability with a number beside it. This shows how many points that model will generate for you, so at the end of your command phase, you add up all of these points, and that's how many you have for the next round. And just a side note, they don't roll over to following rounds, so you'll want to make sure you use them up and don't try to save them for later. Now that you have your points, your Psychers, which are most of your army, can cast from a list of abilities. To quickly go over them from least to most powerful as far as how many points it costs. At 2 points we have Weaver of Fates. It lets you reroll a saving throw for a model within 18 inch of the Psyker you cast it. At 5 points you have Temporal Surge, which lets a unit within 18 inch of the Psyker make a normal move at the start of the shooting phase, so they can move into range of whatever target you want to pick. Then we have Echoes from the Warp, which lets you use a stratagem for 0 CP, so this is trading one resource for another. This is nice if there's nothing you really want to cast, but you're gonna use a stratagem anyways. This is just a good way to use that up. Doombolt is 7 points, and it gives you an 18 inch attack that deals mortal wounds. On the low end, it deals D3, and on the high end, it can deal 9 mortal wounds. So it's swingy, but it can take out some larger hard targets, just as long as they don't have mortal wound resistance. And the highest cost is 9 points, and it's Twist of Fate. Within 18 inches, you pick an enemy unit, and that unit just can't roll armor saving throws, which makes it super squishy. If you use this and have some decently high damage weapons lined up on them, you can just melt about any enemy unit. It's a lot of points, but it's really powerful. There is some counterplay for your opponent here, though. Any unit that is battle shot doesn't generate the points, and obviously dead ones don't either. So you can specifically target the Psychers you generate the most points with either damage or battle shock, and prevent them from building up as many. And most of the abilities have an 18 inch range, so theoretically you could try to keep your high value targets away from enemy Psychers, but it is the Thousand Sons, so good luck doing that. Next up we have the Mech and their detachment ability, which is Rad Cohort, basically radiation bombing. Lore-wise, this is exactly what it sounds like. The Mech just drop radioactive bombs on the battlefield. A lot of Forge worlds already have high levels of radiation, so the Mech don't really think anything of it. They're already immune to it because they're mostly robotic. This ability will work in 2 phases. The first is at the start of the very first battle round, before anything else really happens. This is when the AdMech actually drop the bombs on the enemy. From a gameplay design perspective, I really like that this gives your opponent a choice. They can either choose to take cover or stand firm for every unit in their deployment zone. If they take cover, they are automatically battle shocked. And if the unit stands firm, you roll a dice and on a 3-up they take D3 damage. Depending on your list, there's a lot riding on turn 1, so being battle shocked can really keep your opponent from having an advantage. And then there's stuff like the Thousand Suns ability, where you really don't want your units to be battle shocked because it will have other negative effects that will go into your second turn. But obviously, taking a ton of mortal wounds isn't a great choice either. Then for the rest of the turns, they have to deal with the radiation fallout from these bombs. So any enemy unit in their deployment zone has a 50% chance to take a mortal wound every single turn if it's in their deployment zone. This lets the AdMech basically bully enemies out of their own zone and forces them to move up the board and get punished by the AdMech range units. So I know AdMech isn't crazy strong or anything, just thematically I like the concept and I like how it's implemented. Now, if the rest of the AdMech units can back up that punishment is a different story. I'm just talking about the ability here. So my only real negative to this ability is it's very enemy faction dependent. There are some models or faction that can basically just ignore it. Or some lists that turn 1 will immediately get out of their deployment zone no matter what, so it becomes a non-factor. Like, I typically play Orcs and I'm going to be rushing up the board no matter what, so I'm never going to sit there and just take the damage. So as far as the concept and thematically thinking about what's happening, of them just radiating an entire battlefield as like an opening play, I really like. So that's why it made the list, not because it's actually super powerful. Now we have Drukari, and their army rule, Power from Pain. So in lore, the Drukari cause pain, and they psychically feed on the pain and death they cause. And this gets shown off in their army-wide rule. So this is done on our token system, where you'll be gathering what are called pain tokens throughout the battle. You'll start with a few depending on the battle size, and then you'll gain one every time you destroy an enemy unit, or every time an enemy fails a battle shock test. I like that they have battle shock as well, because if you're fighting a list with not very many enemy units, this should still give you a way to trigger this ability. Besides this, there are other ways to gain pain tokens. Like their detachment rule just gives you more tokens based on what models you take. You have an enhancement that can just generate tokens every turn, and you have a model that gives you a chance of refunding them whenever you use them. What these tokens actually do is you can use them at the start of any phase to empower through pain. This means you give one of your units a buff until the end of phase. If you empower in the move or charge phase, that unit can now reroll advance or charge rolls. And if you empower in the shooting or the fight phase, you can reroll hit rolls. While these individually are pretty basic, there's not a lot of limits to them. Theoretically, if you had a really good turn 1 or 2 and piled up tokens, you could basically dump them all in one turn and give your army some crazy movement and a ton of free rerolls for their shooting or fighting. Making it have kind of the same vibe as like an orc wall, just one turn of absolute carnage. Or you can use them right away and then kind of sparingly use them throughout the battle, only when you need really key moments, like you have to make that charge or you have to get that advance off. Almost more of a miracle dice mechanic. There are several of these token/dice mechanics in 10th edition, but the Drukari have my favorite, partly because it's so based on snowballing. If you play defensively and don't start generating tokens, you won't really have a chance to hit off all those key buffs. But if you start taking out enemies, or at least battle shocking them, you can continue to keep up that pressure and that really high damage. And now we have the Genestealer Cult and their army-wide ability, Cult Ambush. This is probably the most complicated ability out of any of the ones we've talked about, but the concept of the hidden cult members constantly showing up as guerrilla fighters out of nowhere really shines here. This ability actually triggers whenever a Genestealer Cult unit with this ability is destroyed. When that happens, you roll a dice, and if you did a 4 or higher, you can place a Cult Ambush marker anywhere on the board that's more than 9 inches away from an enemy unit. And if your unit is a battle line unit, you automatically pass this and get to place that marker, so you don't even need a roll for it. And then you place that destroyed unit into a Cult Ambush area off the side of the board, which is basically your reserves, just a separate group. Then, at the end of the reinforcement step of your opponent's next movement phase, for each of these tokens you have on the board, you can place one of these destroyed units back onto the board just following the Deep Strike rules. They just have to be touching one of these tokens when you deploy, and when you deploy them, you remove that marker. They come back with full wounds, but if they had a character attached to them like one of the leader units, it doesn't come back, just the bodyguards. Your opponent does have a way to stop this though. If a non-aircraft enemy ends a movement within 9 inches of the marker, that marker is destroyed. But if they don't and the destroyed models come back, then those models will just make another marker when they're destroyed again. If your opponent doesn't have the resources to just chase down markers, they can never stop the cult from constantly popping up and fighting. While the Genestealer cult members may not have the most powerful individual battle line troops, when you can never get rid of them, it can quickly become overwhelming. And because they can die and show up on the other side of the board, they can go wherever they need for the mission. And their detachment rule means every time they come in from reserves, which counts their army ability, they get sustain hits 1 and ignores cover, which are 2 of my favorite weapon keywords. So when they ambush you, it's going to hurt even more.